The night was colder than most that winter, the kind of cold that settled deep in a man's bones and made the world feel lonesome. Wind howled down from the ridge, pushing snow across the plains like a restless ghost. Inside the small ranch house, a single fire burned low, its light flickering against the walls, casting long, trembling shadows. Elias Ward sat by that fire, boots propped near the hearth, hat tilted low over his eyes. He wasn't asleep, not really. Men who lived alone out here rarely truly slept. The land taught them to listen for coyotes, for hoofbeats, for anything that didn't belong. The storm outside had been brewing since sundown, and by midnight it was raging. He reached for his coffee, half gone and cold, when it happened, a sound that didn't belong to the wind. A knock. It was faint, carried off by the storm, but it came again, 3 short raps against the wooden door. Elias froze, his hand hovering near the old rifle leaning against the wall. Out here, miles from town, nobody came calling at this hour unless it was trouble. The firelight caught in his eyes as he stood, slow and deliberate. The floorboards creaked under his boots. Another knock, weaker this time. Whoever it was, they weren't standing easy. Elias unlatched the door and pulled it open against the wind, and there she was. A woman, slumped against the post, snow clinging to her hair and coat, blood dark against her sleeve. Her face was pale, lips trembling from the cold. She looked half ready to fall. Elias caught her before she hit the floor, her weight light but lifeless in his arms. Her breath came in ragged bursts and her hand clutched something tight, a small silver pendant, glinting even in the dim light. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind him, setting her down by the fire. The heat hit her skin, and she stirred, eyes fluttering open for just a moment, soft brown eyes that held both fear and relief. "Easy," Elias muttered under his breath, though his voice was more a whisper to himself than to her. He moved quickly, fetching blankets, stoking the fire higher. The warmth filled the room, crackling and bright, chasing the cold back into the corners. Steam rose from her coat as the ice melted away. He could see the wound now, a bullet graze along her arm, ugly but not deep. Bandit work, maybe. Or worse. As he cleaned and wrapped the wound, the woman stirred again. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper before her voice broke into a cough. "Save your strength," he said softly, steady hands working with quiet precision. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in the fire, the walls, the man who'd opened his door. She seemed unsure if she was safe. He could see it in the way her fingers still clutched that pendant tight against her chest. When he finished tending her wound, he sat back on his heels, studying her face in the glow of the flames. She wasn't from these parts, her dress was torn but fine, city-made. Her boots were too clean for ranch dust. And her hands, though scraped and bruised, didn't carry the calluses of a rancher's life. Whatever road she'd come down, it hadn't been kind. Outside, the storm raged on, snow slashing against the windows. Inside, the fire crackled louder, wrapping them both in its flickering light. Elias poured a cup of warm water, holding it out when she stirred again. Her fingers brushed his trembling, cold, but alive. She drank slowly, eyes never leaving his face. "Thank you," she murmured, voice so soft it almost disappeared beneath the wind. Elias just nodded. Words weren't his strong suit. He moved back to the chair, keeping watch while the storm howled. The woman lay still, eyes half open, gaze drifting to the fire. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the pop of wood and the wind beyond the walls. Finally, as her breathing steadied and her eyes began to close, she whispered something he barely caught. "Please, don't let them find me." Elias looked toward the window, the night beyond black as pitch. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and sharp. He didn't ask who they were. Not yet. But in his gut, he knew the storm had brought more than snow to his door tonight. He leaned forward, fed another log to the fire, and glanced back at the woman sleeping there, fragile, mysterious, wounded. And for the first time in a long while, Elias Ward felt something stir inside him. Something old. Something dangerous. Hope. By the time the storm broke, the world had turned white. Snow blanketed the plains like a fresh start, soft and endless, covering every scar of the night before. The wind had gone quiet, and with it came that deep silence the land holds after surviving a fight with nature. Elias Ward hadn't slept. He sat in his chair through the long hours, firelight dancing across his face, keeping watch over the stranger who'd fallen into his life. The fire had burned low, but she'd stopped shivering. Her breathing was even now, the fever broken. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion swimming in them. She looked around the small cabin, the wooden walls, the shelves of tools and worn books, the old saddle hanging near the door, and then she found him. He was sitting near the hearth, hat in his lap, the lines of his face softened by the morning light. For a moment, she didn't speak. She just watched him, maybe trying to remember how she got there, maybe trying to decide if she was still safe. Elias nodded once, a quiet greeting. "You're awake." She tried to sit up, wincing as her arm pulled against the bandage. He moved to steady her, but she shook her head, stubborn even in weakness. He almost smiled at that. There was a long silence before she finally found her voice. It was soft, worn thin from cold and fear. "I didn't mean to come this far. I didn't know where else to go." Elias poured her a cup of warm broth, set it in her hands. She drank slowly, the color creeping back into her cheeks. "Name's Elias," he said finally. "This here's my place, 3 miles west of Dry Creek. You're safe now." She looked down into her cup. "Safe," she repeated, like the word didn't quite fit in her mouth. He watched her a moment. "What's your name?" The question hung there. She hesitated, eyes flicking to the door, to the window, as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, she said, "Lydia." Then, after a beat, softer, "Lydia Cole." Elias nodded. It suited her somehow, simple, strong, with something hidden beneath it. "Well, Lydia Cole," he said, "you got yourself shot out in the middle of nowhere. You want to tell me how that happened?" She looked into the fire, jaw tightening. "It wasn't supposed to go that way," she whispered. He didn't press. He'd seen that look before, the kind that said a person had been running from something they couldn't quite speak aloud. He knew better than to pry before they were ready. Instead, he stood and walked to the window. The world outside was quiet, snow still falling in lazy flakes. No tracks. No movement. Whatever she'd been running from, it hadn't followed, not yet. Behind him, Lydia spoke again, voice faint. "I'm sorry for your trouble. I didn't mean to bring it to your door." Elias turned, his gaze steady. "Door's been quiet for a long time. Maybe it needed a knock." She blinked, a small flicker of something, surprise, maybe even gratitude, crossing her face. He went back to the hearth, adding a log to the fire. Sparks rose, glowing against the morning gray. "Rest," he said finally. "You'll need your strength." She nodded, but her eyes didn't close. She sat there, watching the flames, fingers absently tracing the small silver pendant that still hung from her neck. Elias noticed it, the way she held it like it was the only thing keeping her steady. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "That pendant means something?" Lydia's eyes flicked up. "It belonged to my sister." Elias waited, but she said no more. Whatever story that pendant carried, it wasn't ready to be told. The sun rose slowly, light spilling through the frost-streaked windows, turning the cabin warm and gold. Outside, the snow glimmered untouched, peaceful, quiet, deceiving. Elias knew peace like that never lasted long out here. By midday, Lydia was strong enough to stand. She moved about the cabin carefully, trying to help, though every motion showed her pain. He didn't stop her. Sometimes work was the only thing that kept a person from remembering what they'd lost. By afternoon, she was outside, watching the light catch on the hills. She looked small against that wide country, but there was something fierce in her stance, a survivor's spirit. Elias stepped onto the porch beside her. The air was cold, crisp, the kind that made your lungs sting. She spoke without looking at him. "You ever lose something that mattered, Mr. Ward?" He stared out at the horizon, where the snow met the sky. "Lost plenty," he said. "But I reckon the things that matter don't stay lost forever." Sometimes they just come knockin' when you least expect. She turned her head, meeting his eyes for a brief second, and in that moment, quiet, tender, uncertain, something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of it. Inside, the fire still burned, steady and bright. The storm had ended, but somewhere far beyond those hills, trouble was already tracking its way toward them. The days that followed were calm, the kind of calm that feels borrowed from a storm yet to return. Snow melted slowly beneath a pale sun, the air carrying that clean scent of thaw and danger. Elias had gone back to work around the ranch, fixing the fence line, feeding the horses, splitting logs out back, and Lydia did what she could to help. She was still weak, her arm bound in fresh bandages, but she refused to sit idle. She washed dishes, swept the floors, and even tried her hand at mending one of his old shirts. He'd caught her doing that once, sitting by the firelight with a needle and thread, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she noticed him watching, she smiled, shy but genuine. It was a rare thing, that smile, one that almost made him forget the question still hanging between them. Who was she really running from? It was mid-afternoon when he decided to ask. The snow outside had begun to soften under the sun, the hills glistening white and gold. Lydia was at the table, folding the clean linens she'd washed. The pendant around her neck caught the light, flashing like a secret begging to be known. Elias set his gloves down and leaned against the doorway. "You've been here 3 days now, Miss Cole," he said quietly. "You don't owe me your story, but I reckon I'd like to know what kind of trouble might come riding this way." Lydia froze for a moment, fingers tightening around the cloth in her hands. Then she sighed, slow and tired, and set it aside. She didn't meet his eyes when she spoke. "You ever loved somebody who wasn't what they seemed?" Elias looked at the fire, his expression unreadable. "Once." Lydia nodded faintly. "Then you'll understand." She rose from the table, walked to the window. Her reflection shimmered in the glass, pale, thoughtful, burdened. "His name was Henry Talbot," she said. "He came to town nearly 2 years ago. Said he was a ranch broker from Abilene. Said all the right things. My father thought him respectable. I thought he was kind." She hesitated, the silence stretching. "We were to be married come spring. Then one night, the sheriff rode out to our house. Said Henry was no ranch broker. Said he was part of a gang rustlers and thieves. Men who'd been runnin' from the law for years. He'd used me, my father's name, his connections. When it came out, everything I had fell to ruin." Elias's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. Lydia's voice trembled as she went on. "I told the sheriff everything I knew. Every letter, every map, every secret he'd ever let slip. They caught him 2 months later. He swore vengeance. Said if he ever got out, he'd come for me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. 3 weeks ago, he escaped. I ran that same night." Elias exhaled slowly, the weight of her story settling like dust in the air. He'd seen that kind of pain before, the kind that changed a person down to the bone. Lydia turned from the window, her eyes glistening but steady. "I didn't mean to bring that trouble to your door. I only meant to keep moving. I didn't expect the snow to fall so fast. I thought I could make it to the next town before night." Elias stepped forward, his voice quiet but sure. "You made it here. That's what matters." She searched his face, like she was trying to believe that. "And what happens when they find me?" He looked out toward the open land, where the wind stirred the last of the snow into tiny spirals. "Then they'll find me too." The words came out low, steady, final. There was no bravado in them, just truth. For a long while, they stood in silence. The fire cracked, the wind shifted, and the weight of what lay ahead settled between them like a promise neither had wanted to make. That night, Elias sat on the porch long after she'd gone to bed. The stars were sharp, the kind that only show up after a storm. He rolled a cigarette he didn't light, just held it between his fingers while his thoughts ran heavy. He'd built his life on solitude, far from anyone else's mess. But now, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the walls around his heart were enough to keep the world out. Inside, Lydia slept uneasily, fingers curled around her pendant. Somewhere in the dark, she dreamed of running again, the sound of hooves, the echo of a man's voice calling her name. And far beyond the horizon, beneath that same cold sky, 3 riders moved through the night. Their lanterns flickered like eyes of fire. They were headed west, following faint tracks in the snow. Tracks that led straight to Elias Ward's door. The 4th morning dawned pale and thin, sunlight bleeding through a veil of fog that clung to the valley. The air had that uneasy stillness, the kind a man feels before a storm or a reckoning. Elias stood out by the corral, his hat low over his eyes, the frost crunching beneath his boots as he fed the horses. His mind wasn't on the feed buckets, though. It was on what Lydia had told him. Every word she'd spoken the night before had cut clean through his quiet life. He'd spent years trying to bury the things that hurt him, the war, the friends he'd lost, the woman who'd left without a goodbye. He'd thought the ranch was enough to keep his heart at peace. But now that peace had been stirred, and he couldn't tell if it was fate's mercy or punishment. Lydia came out onto the porch wrapped in one of his old coats. The morning light caught her hair, loose now, catching gold against the chill. She looked tired, though she smiled softly when their eyes met. He tipped his hat. "You sleep at all?" She shook her head faintly. "Some. The quiet here, it's a strange kind. Peaceful, but too still. Like the world's holding its breath." Elias looked toward the ridges in the east. "Sometimes it is." He didn't tell her that earlier. While the sky was still half dark, he'd seen something that set his nerves on edge, faint glimmers of movement up on the far trail. Could have been deer. Could have been something else. After breakfast, Lydia sat by the window while he saddled one of the horses. He said he'd ride out to the ridge, check the traps, and make sure no wolves had been prowling near the livestock. But both of them knew it was more than that. He wanted to be sure those tracks he'd seen weren't men. As he mounted up, Lydia called out softly, "Be careful, Elias." He gave her that half-smile of his, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Always am." Then he rode out into the white silence of the hills. The higher he climbed, the more the snow gave way to patches of mud and frozen grass. The world opened wide beneath him, the ranch a small dot in the valley, smoke curling from its chimney like a single note of warmth in all that cold emptiness. He followed the ridge until he found what he was looking for: tracks. Not hooves from wild game, not the even prints of a lone rider. These were heavy 3 horses, by his count, all riding close and fast. The snow around them was churned and shallow. They'd come this way not 12 hours ago. He crouched low, touching the edge of one track, feeling how the snow had frozen around it. "Riders," he muttered. 3 of them. The kind of men who didn't ride for pleasure. Back at the cabin, Lydia sat with her hands clasped tight in her lap, staring at the door like it might open any minute. Every creak of the wood made her flinch. She'd been on the run long enough to recognize the sound of fate closing in. When Elias returned near dusk, his expression told her everything before he even spoke. He hung his hat, brushed snow off his coat, and looked her in the eye. "They're comin', Lydia. 3 men, maybe half a day behind. I reckon they've been following your trail since before the storm hit." She went pale, her fingers trembling. "Then it's him. Henry won't stop till he—" Elias raised a hand gently. "We'll handle it." Lydia shook her head. "You don't understand. He'll kill you, Elias. He's not the kind to bluff." He stepped closer, his voice low and calm. "I've faced worse men than him. And I've lost enough good things in my life to know when something's worth standing for." For a heartbeat, she just stared at him, at the quiet strength in his eyes, the steady resolve of a man who'd seen storms come and go and still stood tall. Then her voice broke, soft and scared. "Why would you do this for me?" Elias looked at her like the answer had been there all along. "Because you knocked on my door. And I opened it." That night, the air turned colder again. The wind picked up, whistling through the pine branches. Lydia packed what little she had, a few clothes, her pendant, the small locket that had once held her mother's picture. Elias checked his rifle, loaded it, then laid it by the door. Neither said much as the night deepened, the fire crackling low between them. There was no need for words now. Far off in the dark, wolves howled. And beneath that mournful cry, faint but growing clearer, came another sound, the rhythmic thunder of horses. 3 riders, closing in on the ranch. The firelight flickered against Elias's face, casting shadows like scars across his jaw. He stood, calm as the eye of a storm, and whispered to himself more than to her, "Reckon this night's gonna test what we're made of." Lydia turned toward the sound, heart pounding. Somewhere deep inside, fear gave way to something stronger, a flicker of hope, of trust. Because for the first time since she'd run, she wasn't alone anymore. The wind had gone sharp by the time the riders reached the outer edge of the valley. From the porch, Elias could see their silhouettes against the moonlight, 3 dark shapes cutting slow and steady through the snow. They weren't in a hurry now, men that confident rarely were. He stood there for a long while, one hand resting on the post, the other hovering near his sidearm. His mind was quiet, not blank, not afraid, just calm in that way a man becomes when the choice has already been made. Behind him, the fire crackled low, casting long amber shadows across the room. Lydia sat near it, clutching her pendant tight enough to leave marks in her skin. He turned to her once, his voice soft but steady. "When I tell you, you go down to the cellar. There's a trapdoor under the rug by the stove. Stay there till I come for you." Her lips parted, trembling. "And if you don't come back?" He paused, eyes locked on hers. "Then you light that lantern down there and wait. I'll find a way." She wanted to argue, to tell him she wouldn't hide while he faced them alone, but the words caught in her throat. Something about the way he stood there, broad-shouldered and unshaken, made her believe he'd weathered worse storms than this. Outside, the riders slowed to a stop about 50 yards from the porch. The sound of horses snorting in the cold carried through the air. Then a voice rose loud, smooth, and filled with that cruel confidence only a man like Henry Talbot could own. "Evenin', Cowboy," he called. "Hope we ain't interruptin' your hospitality. Seems you've taken in a guest of mine." Elias stepped out from under the porch roof, rifle slung casually in his hands. The moonlight caught his face calm, carved with the kind of resolve only the lonely plains could teach. "She ain't yours," he said flatly. A low laugh rolled from the darkness. "Ain't she, though? She took something from me. My good name. My freedom. My future. I just came to collect what's owed." Elias cocked the rifle slowly, the sound echoing sharp and clean. "You come one step closer to this house, you'll be collectin' nothin' but lead." The other 2 men shifted in their saddles, uneasy. Henry dismounted, his boots sinking into the snow. The moon caught the glint of his pistol. "You don't even know her, mister. Why die for a stranger?" Elias's answer was quiet but sure. "Because a man's worth somethin' only if he stands for what's right. She came to my door hurt and afraid. That's all I needed to know." Inside, Lydia watched from the window, her heart pounding. The firelight painted her face gold, but her hands were cold as ice. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, but another voice, small and fierce, whispered that running had never brought her peace. Henry's shadow moved closer. "You got no part in this, Cowboy. Step aside, and I'll let you live to see another sunrise." Elias took a step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. "Ain't the kind of sunrise I'd care to see." Silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. The night air trembled with it. Then the sharp crack of a gunshot. The flash lit up the snow like lightning. Elias dove to one side, rolling into cover behind the hitching post. The bullet slammed into the porch beam, splintering wood. His rifle came up in a blur, one clean shot, and one of Henry's men fell hard from his horse, snow blooming red beneath him. Lydia cried out softly, covering her mouth. The sound tore through Elias worse than the wind. He fired again, forcing the others to scatter behind a boulder near the corral. Henry's laughter rose again, low, savage. "You got grit, Cowboy. I'll give you that." Elias ducked low, reloading fast. "You talk too much." Another shot ripped through the air, grazing his shoulder. He grunted, pressed a hand to the wound, and fired back, the crack echoing across the valley like thunder. Inside, Lydia couldn't stand it any longer. She ran to the door, heart pounding, voice shaking. "Elias, please stop. You'll be killed." He turned, just long enough to meet her eyes. "Get down. Before she could move, another gunshot split the night, this one so close she felt it in her bones. The lantern by the window shattered, glass scattering across the floor. Smoke curled up into the air, the smell of gunpowder thick. Then silence. The kind that hums in your ears after chaos. When it cleared, Henry's voice came again, colder now. You can't win, Ward. She's marked. Wherever she goes, the past'll find her. You can't save her from that. Elias rose slowly from behind cover, blood on his sleeve, but eyes unflinching. Maybe not, he said. But I can damn sure try. He fired. One last shot, clean, decisive, final. Henry staggered back, disbelief etched across his face as he crumpled into the snow. His last breath came out like smoke, vanishing into the dark. The remaining rider turned and fled, the sound of hooves fading fast into the hills. For a long moment, Elias stood there in the cold, chest heaving, smoke curling from the barrel of his rifle. Snow began to fall again, slow, quiet, like the world was trying to wash away what had just happened. Lydia stepped out onto the porch, tears on her cheeks, the pendant trembling in her grip. She looked at him, the man who had stood between her and death, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid. Elias met her gaze. No words passed between them, but the fire behind his eyes said it all. He'd opened his door once. Now, somehow, it felt like fate had opened his heart in return. Morning came soft and gray, like the sky itself didn't have the strength to rise. Snow still drifted down slow and lazy, covering the ground in a clean white sheet, hiding the scars of what had happened only hours before. Elias moved through the quiet with the steady calm of a man who'd buried more than one ghost. The rifle hung loose at his side, his sleeve still dark from where blood had seeped through the bandage. Out past the barn, two shapes lay still in the snow, one of Henry's men, and Henry himself. Lydia watched from the porch, wrapped in his coat. She didn't cry. Not yet. Maybe she didn't have tears left, or maybe she'd learned the hard way that some grief comes slow, creeping in like a storm cloud days after the thunder's gone. Elias stopped a few paces away from her. Best we lay to rest proper, he said, voice rough from smoke and silence. She nodded faintly. I'll help. They didn't speak much after that. Together, they dug two shallow graves near the tree line, the earth stiff and unyielding beneath their shovels. The air was quiet except for the scrape of metal and the soft thud of snow. When it was done, Elias stood there a long while, hat in hand. He didn't pray, not out loud. But his eyes lifted skyward, and Lydia could tell he was speaking to someone, maybe to the good Lord, maybe to the ghosts that rode beside him every night. When he finally looked back down, there was a weight gone from his shoulders, replaced by something gentler. Lydia whispered, I didn't mean for you to carry my troubles, Elias. He turned to her, snowflakes gathering on his hat brim. Ain't how trouble works, Lydia. You don't choose it. You just face it when it comes knockin'. They walked back to the cabin, the cold biting but bearable now. Inside, the fire had burned low, a few glowing coals still pulsing in the hearth. Lydia knelt beside it, feeding in small pieces of wood until the flames came alive again. Elias poured water from the kettle, set it to warm. Then he sat across from her, silent, watching her hands, delicate, trembling, yet somehow steady. When she finally looked up, her voice was soft. You could have let me go that first night. Could have turned me away. Elias stared into the fire. Could have, he said. But when I saw you on that porch, half frozen, scared out of your mind, I knew if I turned you away, I wouldn't sleep easy another night in my life. The way he said it wasn't romantic, not in the way city folks talked about love. It was plain, honest, the kind of truth that sinks deep into the bones. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they didn't dare to say out loud, the gratitude, the fear, the small spark of something neither dared name. By afternoon, the snow eased off. Lydia stepped outside to hang a line of washed linens, her breath fogging the air. The world smelled clean, washed new. Elias was out by the corral again, tightening a post. When he looked up, she was watching him. Their eyes met across the yard, and for a heartbeat, it felt like time stopped. The kind of moment that doesn't need words, where everything that's been broken starts quietly mending itself. Later that evening, she found him by the fire again, stitching up the tear in his coat. She sat down beside him, close enough to feel the heat. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, she said, "When I ran from Henry, I didn't know where I was headed. I just knew I had to keep going. But when I saw your cabin light through the snow, it felt like I'd found something I didn't even know I was looking for." Elias's hands stilled on the thread. He didn't look at her, not right away, but his voice was low and real. "Sometimes the good Lord sends folks our way when we need 'em most. Don't always make sense at the time." She smiled, small, tired, but full of something warm. "You really believe that?" He finally looked at her then, eyes soft with the kind of truth a man doesn't say often. "I do now." That night, they didn't say goodnight the way they usually did. She lingered by the fire a moment longer, her hand brushing his arm as she passed. It was a small thing, but in that quiet cabin, it felt like the start of something neither of them could deny anymore. Elias stayed up after she'd gone to bed, staring into the flames. He thought about the woman who'd knocked on his door, broken and hunted, and how she'd somehow brought life back into a house that had forgotten what laughter sounded like. Outside, the snow glowed silver under the moonlight. The world was still again, not the heavy kind of stillness that came before a storm, but the peaceful kind that follows one. And for the first time in years, Elias Ward let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the fire in his cabin wasn't the only one worth keeping lit. 2 weeks have passed since the night the guns went quiet. The snow thinned, the air softened, and the world seemed to breathe again. The wounds on Elias's arm had healed into a faint scar, a reminder of the night the past came calling. Life settled into a quiet rhythm at the ranch. Mornings came with the smell of coffee and the sound of Lydia humming while she swept near the hearth. Evenings ended with the two of them sitting by the fire, trading small stories, hers of the town she'd left behind, his of the years he'd spent riding fences and chasing the horizon. They didn't talk much about what lay ahead. Maybe neither dared to hope too loudly. But there was a calm between them now, the kind that only comes after a storm passes and both souls realize they survived together. Then one morning, a sound broke that calm. Hoofbeats. Lydia was hanging laundry outside when she heard it, the faint rhythm of a single horse approaching down the valley trail. Her stomach tightened. She looked toward the ridge, where a lone rider was cutting through the mist. Not rough like an outlaw, not reckless like a drifter. Measured. Purposeful. Elias stepped out from the barn, hand instinctively going to his sidearm. "Stay close," he said quietly. The rider slowed as he neared the fence, raising one gloved hand in greeting. He was dressed neatly, a worn duster, badge glinting at his chest. "Morning," he called, voice even. "Name's Marshall Dillard. You, Elias Ward." Elias nodded once. "That's right." The marshal dismounted, snow crunching beneath his boots. He glanced at Lydia, polite but sharp, the kind that sees more than it says. "Sorry to trouble you. Been riding through these parts of skin after a woman, Lydia Cole. There's word she might have been mixed up in a shootin' over in Abilene. Her fiancé's dead. A couple of men, too." Lydia froze. Her hands gripped the porch rail till her knuckles went white. Elias's eyes narrowed. "That's so." The marshal sighed, brushing the frost from his coat. "Word is she was kidnapped by the man, Henry Talbot. But folks can't seem to agree on who fired the first shot when it all went wrong. Just looking for answers." Lydia stepped forward then, her voice trembling but firm. "Marshal, I'm Lydia Cole. I told the sheriff everything before I ran. Henry wasn't my fiancé, he was my mistake. He used me. Lied to me. The night he came for me here, he would have killed us both if Elias hadn't stopped him." The marshal studied her for a moment, then looked at Elias. "Is that true?" Elias met his gaze head-on. "Every word. You can write out back if you need proof. The snow might have buried most of it, but there are 2 graves near the tree line. One's marked Henry Talbot." For a long moment, the marshal said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Heard of Talbot. Rustler. Escaped from a federal wagon last month. Suppose that makes this mess clearer." He looked at Lydia again, his tone softening. You did what you had to, Miss Cole. Can't hold that against you. Lydia exhaled, shaky relief spilling through her chest. So, I'm free to go. The marshal hesitated. Far as the law's concerned, yes. But if you plan on staying in these parts, I'd recommend telling your story straight to the county judge. Folks around here spook easily, and rumors spread faster than wildfire. Elias nodded. We'll head into town when the thaw hits. The marshal tipped his hat. Glad to hear it. You take care of yourself, Miss Cole. When he rode off, the silence that followed was heavy, uncertain. Lydia stood staring after him, her eyes distant. Elias stepped closer. You all right? She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. I thought it was over, Elias. I thought once he was gone, I could just start over. He looked at her, really looked at her, the wind tugging at the strands of her hair, the firelight of the house glowing behind her. Maybe startin' over don't mean forgettin' what came before. Maybe it just means fasten it with someone who won't let you fall. Her breath hitched, and before she could stop herself, she reached for him, just a hand against his chest, steady and trembling all at once. And you do that? For me. Elias's hand covered hers. Warm. Firm. Ain't I already? The words hung there, soft as falling snow. That evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset burn gold across the valley. Lydia leaned against his shoulder, and for the first time since she'd knocked on his door, her heartbeat found a steady rhythm again. But as the last of the light faded, Elias's eyes stayed on the horizon. Because a man who's lived through enough storms knows, peace doesn't always last long out here. And somewhere beyond those far ridges, the wind carried whispers of new riders, new trials, and the test of what their hearts could endure when love and duty collide. 3 days after the marshal rode off, the snow began to melt in earnest. The hills turned slick with mud, rivers of thawed ice cutting through the pasture like veins of silver. Spring was coming slow, hesitant, but certain, and with it, the pull of unfinished business. Elias knew they couldn't stay holed up forever. The marshal had been right. Folks in small towns had long memories and quick tongues. If Lydia wanted her name cleared for good, they'd have to face them. So one morning, just as the fog began to lift, he saddled 2 horses and set out with her for Dry Creek, the nearest settlement 10 miles east. The ride was quiet. Lydia sat straight in her saddle, the wind tugging her hair loose, her eyes far off. She'd worn one of Elias's scarves to guard against the chill, and though her face was calm, he could see the storm still living behind her eyes. When they reached the town, everything seemed smaller than it should have been. A few wooden shops, a saloon, the church steeple leaning a little like it had grown tired of standing upright. Folks stopped what they were doing as soon as the pair rode in. The whispers started low but carried quickly. That's her? The one from Abilene. Marshall said she was runnin' from something. Don't look like trouble to me. Looks like heartbreak walkin' on 2 feet. Elias dismounted first, offering Lydia his hand. She took it without hesitation, her fingers cool but steady. Together, they walked toward the sheriff's office. Inside, Sheriff McKinney was sitting behind his desk, boots propped up, a newspaper in his lap. When he saw them, he raised a brow. Well, now, I reckon the rumors were true. Yo, you ward. Elias nodded. And this is Lydia Cole. She's here to set the record straight. The sheriff leaned forward, studying her. That so? I already heard from Marshal Dillard. Said you and Ward handled yourselves fine when Talbot came calling. Seems to me the case is closed. Lydia blinked. Then, I'm free to stay. McKinney smiled faintly. This town doesn't have much use for ghosts or gossip, Miss Cole. You stay quiet, help where you can, and in a month folks'll forget what they thought they knew. She exhaled, relief softening her shoulders. Thank you, Sheriff. But as they turned to leave, a voice from outside called her name, sharp, cutting. Lydia Cole. They stepped out to find a group of townsfolk gathered near the general store. Among them stood Clara Hewitt, a woman Lydia had once known from church back in Abilene, proud, stern, her chin lifted high. I heard what happened, Clara said coldly. You should have stayed gone. You brought death once. We don't need it here. The words sliced deep. Lydia's hands trembled, and Elias stepped forward, jaw set. "That's enough," he said quietly. "Ain't no death here. Just two people trying to live." Clara scoffed. "You don't know her." Elias's voice dropped, low and certain. "I know she's got more courage than half the men I've met in my life. That's enough for me." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then an old rancher spat in the dust and said, "Reckon he's right. Folks have done worse and been forgiven." The crowd broke apart soon after, muttering, but no one else spoke against them. Lydia stood there trembling, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. When they were finally alone again, she turned to Elias. "Why'd you do that? You don't owe me your reputation." He looked at her, steady, unflinching. "Reputation doesn't mean much when it's built on silence. You're not alone in this, Lydia. Not anymore." She swallowed hard, her heart heavy with gratitude and something deeper she still couldn't name. They spent the rest of the day gathering supplies, flour, salt, and a few nails for the fence. Folks kept their distance, but now and then someone would nod politely. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. As the sun dipped low and the two rode home, Lydia turned to look at him. "You could have stayed out of this, Elias. Could have kept your life simple." He chuckled softly. "Simple's overrated. I reckon peace don't come from hidin', comes from choosing the right kind of fight." The words settled between them like a vow. That night, back at the cabin, the fire burned bright again. Lydia sat on the rug, brushing her hair dry after the rain caught them on the trail. Elias sat in his chair nearby, watching her quietly. She looked up after a while, the faintest smile on her lips. "You think people really can start over?" He thought about it, eyes on the flames. "I think the past doesn't ever leave you. But sometimes it gives you a chance to write the rest differently." Lydia set her brush aside, her gaze steady on him. "And how would you write ours?" Elias leaned forward, his voice soft, deep as the wind outside. "I'd write it slowly. Honest. Two souls that found each other when they'd stopped looking. The room went quiet after that, not an empty quiet, but one thick with something new, something alive. The storm had passed, but the fire between them was just beginning to catch. Outside, the snowmelt trickled through the grass, carrying winter away. Inside, two hearts learned what it meant to stay. Spring had laid her gentle hands upon the valley by the time peace began to feel real again. The air was warmer now, carrying the sweet smell of wet sage and the distant murmur of creeks breaking loose from winter's hold. The hills wore a coat of green again, and the horses grazed along the fence line like they'd never known snow. Elias's cabin had changed, too. There were fresh curtains Lydia had sewn from old flour sacks, and the table, once empty, now held wildflowers in a chipped vase. It wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a home. Each morning began the same, Elias tending to the horses, Lydia kneeling by the garden patch she'd started near the porch. He'd sometimes pause just to watch her there, sunlight catching in her hair as she hummed softly under her breath. It was a quiet rhythm, built not on grand promises, but on shared silence and steady work. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and painted the sky gold, Elias sat by the fire carving a small wooden horse. Lydia sat near him, mending one of his shirts. There was comfort in the sound of the knife against the wood, the whisper of thread through cloth. "Been thinkin'," Elias said after a while, eyes still on his carving. "About taking some of the cattle to market next month. Maybe get you that piano you keep staring at in town." Lydia laughed softly, shaking her head. "You heard me say I didn't play much." He smiled. "Didn't say you had to. Just think this house oughta have music in it." Her hands stilled, her eyes warm with something unspoken. "It already does," she said quietly. "You just don't hear it the same way I do." Elias looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that carried more than words ever could. The fire crackled, filling the silence between them with its soft, steady heartbeat. But peace, real peace, never lasts forever. The next morning, Elias rode into town to trade some supplies. He left before dawn, promising he'd be back by supper. Lydia watched him go, her heart uneasy for reasons she couldn't name. By midday, the wind had turned. The sky darkened again, Not with snow this time, but with dust, the kind that rolled in heavy and restless. She went about her chores, trying not to notice the weight in her chest. When the sound of hooves came hours later, she hurried to the porch, expecting Elias. But it wasn't him. A man she didn't recognize reined his horse near the gate, tall, broad-shouldered, with a dark coat and a face weathered by years of hard living. His eyes found hers with unsettling familiarity. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Garrett. I'm looking for Elias Ward." Her breath caught. "He's not here. He went to town." Garrett nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the barn, the fences, the home Elias had built. Figures. Always was the workin' type. Something in his tone set her on edge. "You know him?" He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We rode together once. A long time ago. Guess I just came to settle an old debt." Before she could ask what he meant, he turned his horse toward the tree line. "Tell him Garrett stopped by. He'll know what for." And, just like that, he was gone, swallowed by the dust and wind. When Elias returned that evening, Lydia met him at the door, her voice trembling. "A man came by. Said his name was Garrett." Elias froze mid-step. His hand tightened around the reins, and for a moment, he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was quiet, rough. "Did he say what he wanted?" "He said you'd know." Elias nodded slowly, staring into the distance where the storm clouds gathered over the ridge. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know." Lydia stepped closer. "Elias, who is he?" He looked at her, the woman who had come into his life by chance, who had changed everything without trying. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "A mistake I left behind a long time ago. And looks like it finally found me again." Lydia reached for his hand, her touch steady. "Then we'll face it together." But Elias shook his head. "No, Lydia. Not this one. Some things a man's got to face alone." He turned toward the barn, the fading light cutting across his face. In that moment, he looked like every man who'd ever carried the weight of his past, proud, burdened, and unwilling to let the woman he loved bear it with him. Lydia stood in the doorway long after he was gone inside, the wind tugging at her dress. She knew that whatever waited on the horizon, it wouldn't just test him. It would test everything they had built together. And for the first time since that winter night she'd knocked on his door, she was afraid that the fire that had kept them both alive might soon have to face another storm. That night, the sky hung low and heavy over the valley. The moon was a thin silver blade cutting through the dark, and the air carried a chill that felt like a warning. Elias couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire long after Lydia had gone to bed, the flames dancing against the walls like restless ghosts. He kept hearing that name, Garrett, like a hammer against his thoughts. They'd ridden together back when Elias was younger, wilder, before he'd settled down and tried to build something good out of the ruins of his old life. Garrett had been a brother once, before greed and pride turned him mean. There'd been a job gone wrong, a gunfight that left a man dead, and Garrett had blamed Elias ever since. Elias knew now, this wasn't just a visit. Garrett was coming to settle that old score, and men like him didn't come to talk. Before dawn, Elias saddled his horse and packed a rifle. Lydia woke to the sound of leather creaking and boots on the floor. She stepped out of the bedroom, her hair loose, a shawl around her shoulders. "You're leaving," she said quietly. Elias didn't turn right away. "Just need to meet him before he brings trouble here." Her voice broke slightly. "You can't do this alone, Elias. Please." He faced her then, his eyes soft but steady. "I have to, Lydia. I brought this here. You gave me peace I didn't deserve. Now I need to make sure it stays." She stepped closer, her hand finding his arm. "I don't care about peace if it means losing you." He looked at her, really looked, and something in his face softened like the frost giving way to spring. "You won't lose me. I promise." He leaned in then, pressing his forehead gently to hers. "You stay by that fire. Keep it burnin'. I'll find my way back to it." And with that, he was gone. The morning rose slowly and gray. Lydia watched from the porch as Elias disappeared into the trees, the mist swallowing him whole. Her heart felt heavy as stone, but her faith held steady. She went inside, stoked the fire higher, and prayed to a god she wasn't sure was listening. Meanwhile, miles down the ridge, Elias rode into the canyon where he knew Garrett would be waiting. The wind was sharp there, whistling through the rocks like an old hymn. Garrett stood by his horse, leaning on a rifle, his coat flapping in the wind. "Knew you'd come," he said. Elias dismounted slowly. "Didn't figure I had a choice." Garrett smirked. "You had a choice years ago, when you left me to take the fall." "I didn't leave you," Elias said evenly. "You ran when things went bad. You left me to bury what was left." Garrett's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on the gun. "You always were good with words, Ward. But words don't change blood." Elias's voice was calm, but his heart beat hard. "You come all this way to spill mine?" Garrett shrugged. "Just to balance the scales." The wind fell silent for a moment, the kind of stillness that only comes before thunder. Then, in the space between heartbeats, a gun flashed. 2 shots cracked through the canyon. The echoes rolled across the hills like thunder chasing the sky. When the dust cleared, Garrett lay on the ground, clutching his shoulder, his gun skittering into the rocks. Elias stood over him, chest heaving, smoke rising from his revolver. Garrett looked up, eyes filled not with rage now, but something close to sorrow. "Guess you still shoot straight." Elias knelt beside him. "Didn't come here to kill you, Garrett. Just to end this." Garrett gave a bitter laugh, blood staining his coat. "Ain't no end for men like us." Elias looked out over the canyon, the wide, endless stretch of land that had swallowed so many stories like theirs. "There is if we choose it." He left Garrett there with his horse, a canteen, and enough food to make it out. Then he turned back toward home. By the time Elias reached the cabin, night had fallen again. The fire was still burning bright, alive, and waiting. Lydia was sitting by it, her eyes fixed on the door like she'd willed it not to stay empty. When he stepped inside, she rose and ran to him, relief breaking across her face like dawn. He caught her in his arms, holding her close, feeling the tremor in her breath against his chest. "You kept it burnin'," he whispered. "I told you I would." He drew back just enough to see her face, tired, tear-streaked, beautiful in the glow of the firelight. "It's over now," he said. "All of it." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time to stop running, Dot." Elias nodded, his hand cupping her cheek. "Yeah, maybe it is." They sat together before the hearth, the fire crackling between them, the shadows dancing against the walls. Outside, the night was quiet, no storms, no gunfire, no ghosts. Just the sound of the wind whispering through the pines and the steady rhythm of 2 hearts finding rest. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Lydia reached out, her fingers tracing the scar on his hand. "You saved me once, Elias. But I think maybe you were the one who needed Savon all along." He smiled, small, genuine, the kind that only comes from knowing pain and choosing love anyway. "Reckon we saved each other." The flames flickered low, painting them in gold and shadow. The world outside might forget their names someday, 2 lost souls who found each other by chance, but for now, under that wide Texas sky, they'd written their own kind of forever. And as the last embers glowed, the fire that had once welcomed a wounded stranger burned steadily, a light against the long, wild night. Because some doors, once opened by kindness, never truly close. And some hearts, once found, never lose their way home again.